This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Studies show that climate change has had a huge and destructive impact over large parts of Africa in the last few decades. Seasons have become increasingly unpredictable. Floods now alternate with prolonged periods of drought. Even the rare cyclone has become a common occurrence. The UN Climate Change Conference, COP27, held in Egypt's Red Sea port city of Sharm El-Sheikh, presented delegates with yet another opportunity to chart a path out of the global climate crisis. Now, this week on the program, we'll look at what Africa put on the table at COP27, recap discussions around key issues of concern to the continent, and project what lies ahead post Sharm El-Sheikh. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, Africa went to COP27 with a clear agenda. Similarly, it expected clear outcomes. Before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at how some of the discussions unfolded and how Africa fared. CGTN's Adel Mahroui sat down with Professor Lee White, the Minister of Forests, Oceans, Environment and Climate Change of the Gabonese Republic, to find out more.
Mr. Minister, thank you very much for being with us on Talk Africa. COP27 has brought back the attention to Africa as it comes to the continent that is most vulnerable. And when we talk about financing and funds, many years ago Africa was promised about 100 billion, and now with the expectations of more rise in temperature and the implications we've seen this year of extreme weather, these numbers are growing tremendously and the commitments have not been there. Have you seen any indications in this COP that will point that Africa, at a certain point, will be getting what it has been promised?
There are two problems there. The 100 billion is for developing nations, so the 152 developing nations, of which 54 are in Africa. So one would expect about a third of that money to be coming to Africa, and actually probably proportionately slightly more because we're the continent the worst impacted. And so maybe you'd expect 40, 45, 50% to come to Africa. So let's say that's 50 billion. Well, the developed nations claim that last year they mobilized 82. It should have been 100, it was only 82. But unfortunately, within that 82, there's a lot of loans and commercial loans. Or concessional loans, but when you look at what is actually hitting the ground, Gabon as a average-sized African country would expect to be seeing $200–400 million per year now in climate resilience projects and in payment for our reduced emissions through the RED+ process and so on. And I'm only seeing 5 or 10 million. And so there's a significant problem with delivery on the 100 billion and transparency on the 100 billion. Who has put how much, in what form? Is it concessional loans? Is it commercial loans? Really, it shouldn't be loans. We shouldn't have to borrow money and indebt our countries to get out of this problem. The idea of the 100 billion was that the developed world, recognizing that it had created the problem, should be putting 100 billion of money that can be dispersed to developing nations to deal with adaptation, loss and damage, mitigation, and so on. So how much have they actually mobilized? How much of that is in the form of money that will be gifted to countries rather than loaned to countries? Why, when we look at how much money was mobilized for COVID, for example, which was an immediate threat, why, when we can mobilize trillions for COVID, can we not even honor that 100 billion that was committed in Copenhagen 13, 14 years ago? And at least in our case, really is still not hitting the ground. I don't see that money.
And that has created frustrations among some African nations. We've seen in this COP, African countries coming out boldly saying that they will object to any restrictions for them tapping into their own oil and gas reserves or exportation, as that is essential for a continent that has huge energy poverty. It has huge issues in terms of economic growth, and they believe that restricting access to oil and gas will hinder economic growth in general. How have you seen that stance?
Gabon is an oil producer. But we're also a country, one of the few countries that absorbs more CO2 than we emit. So we're positive. And so we actually offset all of our oil emissions. Actually, I mean, it's a very complex problem because of climate change, the demand for oil is going to decrease. And because oil projects tend to have such a long lifespan, any exploration that we're doing today is going to result in production in 5-10 years, with fields that need to be economically active for 20-30 years. And the reality is, the world's not going to be buying oil in 20-30 years' time. You know, the oil economy is going to reduce, whether we want it to or not. So as Gabon, we're looking at how do we adapt economically to this future where our oil will not be selling. We can pump as much as we want, but if nobody's buying it, and so I think some of these debates about exploring new oil fields in Africa, you know, it's a principle debate, and it's an indication of how much frustration there is that developed nations are not delivering on their commitments, their contract with developing nations to provide funding and to fund the just energy transition. You know, in Gabon, we're taking commercial loans to fund renewable energy. That's not how it's meant to work. There's meant to be concessional funding at the very least through this process to fund our just energy transition. You know, when it comes to this idea that we should be free to produce as much oil as we want because the developed nations have already had their share, if you want, of the carbon space, that becomes a little bit problematic for Africa because we're the continent that will suffer the most. So if we start emitting CO2, more and more CO2, even though you can argue it's our right, for every ton of carbon dioxide we emit, we risk putting Africans at risk. Yeah, and so it's a catch-22. Some countries feel that they need the oil to develop, but by producing that oil, they're going to be resulting in other Africans suffering. And so that's one of the really difficult problems we have to grapple with here at the negotiations.
Into the green energy transition. So how is that going, and how has COP27 dealt with accelerating Africa's green transition into new energy?
I would say that the green transition is really picking up speed. In Glasgow, there were maybe 1 or 2 or 3 side events on green hydrogen. Here there are 25, 30 side events on green hydrogen. So we see the world really picking up and starting to invest in green energy. We've seen green energy becoming actually a cheaper form of energy in many places. But we're not seeing the investment in Africa. We're not seeing, you know, the funding becoming available for that just transition in Africa.
Someone trying to highlight issues like having the loss and damage on the agenda, or establishing UNEP and UNFCCC going for a 5-year plan to accelerate green technologies in developing countries, stuff like that. I mean, are these things that are concrete to you, or you need to see more actionable decisions?
I need to see action on the ground to be convinced. Loss and damage, it took us 26 years to get it on the agenda. So yes, it's a good thing that we're talking about it, but we're only talking about it. And there's a lot of inertia there. So the impression is that many developed nations would be perfectly happy to talk about it for another 10 years, whereas there are countries that desperately need. You know, there are 33 million people in Pakistan underwater. There are 22 million people in the Horn of Africa who are dying because of a very severe drought. Loss and damage is real and is happening today, and is a life and death situation. It's, you know, small islands are seeing entire economies wiped out in one night, and so loss and damage is real, and there needs to be a fund, and it needs to be paying money out tomorrow, not in 10 years' time. It's great to be focusing on this energy transition and initiating new 5-year plans, but why is it not working right now? You know, why in Gabon do we struggle to fund our hydroelectric projects and our solar projects? It should be easy. It should be the easiest part of this negotiation, because electricity projects are profit-making. If you invest in green energy in Africa, you actually make profits. But even in that profit-making sector, we're not making the transition fast enough. So yeah, there may be some positive indications, some good ideas, but I really want to see action on the ground.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for giving us your time and Talk Africa.
Thank you.
Right, very interesting discussions there. Well, we are going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we will deconstruct some of the discussions of interest at COP27 and find out what this means for Africa. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Before the break, we heard from Professor Lee White, Minister of Forests, Oceans, Environment and Climate Change of the Gabonese Republic. Let's now delve deeper into the key issues for Africa at COP27. And joining me from Nairobi, Gulaid Atan, Director of the IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Center. And joining us from Lagos, John Ekoko, Climate and Environmental Expert. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. John, if I may start off with you, because in his address, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated that the world is on a highway to climate hell. He also spoke about a key target to stop global temperatures being under threat. Is the 1.5-degree goal likely to slip?
The goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels is not looking likely today. One, there is still a lot of carbon being released into the air by the developed countries, much more than the developing countries. Two, Africa, particularly the less developed countries, when they went to COP27, they went with a few priorities.
Right.
One was looking at the climate impact itself. And they were looking at adaptation, they were looking at loss, they were looking at the damage caused by climate change. The next one is looking at mitigation. The third one is looking at the finance, technology, and capacity building to allow Africa to be able to respond. All of these were supposed to give Africa an enhanced capacity to be able to respond to the climate challenge.
John, you've talked about Africa pushing for certain actions to be done at COP27. What are some of those actions exactly? And what can you tell us more so about the standoff that has pitted rich nations against the poor ones?
Africa has been pushing for adaptation, for support to adapt to the effect of the climate change. And part of it is looking at our vulnerabilities, looking at our resources, looking at our capacity, looking at our technology, and of course, finance itself. You are aware that in COP25, $100 billion annually was supposed to be put together, principally to assist Africa up to 2025, or the developing world. However, the money has not been gathered up till now. And there is a talk of increasing to 150 billion up to that 2025 to make resources available for Africa to be able to respond.
Let me bring in Gulaid in here. Gulaid, this year's climate summit was expected to finally be the African COP. We've heard John's frustrations there over what is coming out of the climate conference. Now, the African COP was supposed to put the needs of the continent front and center. In your view, though, did this happen?
It happened, but it didn't happen as much we wish it. The African countries put their perspective on the climate change on the agenda, and as the UN Secretary General said, and you repeated, that we are on the highway to hell with our foot on the accelerator. Actually, this region is closer to hell than any other region. By the way, we are over already 1.5 in this region, degrees above pre-industrial levels. What Africa actually had mainly, the biggest thing on the agenda was to put on the agenda the loss and damage agenda. And this is the first time it happened. It is on the agenda, but Africa has some successes. Also, another item agenda on the African countries' position was to advocate more support for adaptation. Till now, most of the climate funding that has been spent has been on mitigations.
Right. So, Gulaid, in your view, one of the key issues at the COP27 was that inclusion of the loss and damage. What is this loss and damage, and what exactly does it mean for Africa?
Let me put it in perspective first. Africa has contributed less than 4% on all the global emissions on greenhouse gases. So, but we are suffering the brunt of the consequences of the greenhouses due to our location and also to our economic model that's more dependent on agriculture, that's dependent on rainfall. So the loss and damage is that, what we're talking is that those damages that are caused, that are due to climate, who will bear the responsibility of paying those damages? And as you know now, in this region we have a drought that's going almost on 3 years. So drought that we haven't seen for the last 70, 80 years. Quite unusual. Although it's quite difficult to attribute to climate change, definitely climate change has a lot to do with it.
Right. So, John, let me come back to you on this one, because one of the issues that seems to be of critical importance is that one of adaptation. And reports are putting the annual cost of adaptation in developing countries at about $300 billion by 2030, up from about $140 billion. Have there been any decisions made, though, on that long-standing issue of climate finance?
A few decisions have been made. However, they are still in the realm of planning. It is basic that most of the fund will come from the public sector. In addition to that, there are efforts going on to get the organized private sector, the multilateral development banks and the bilateral development banks to actually key into this process, to increase their scope and their portfolio for dealing with climate impacts in Africa. Another thing also is the adaptation fund that was discussed. which Africans are saying should actually observe the principle of equity and common basis different responsibilities, as well as the respective capacities, looking particularly at the position of African countries and developing, which is less than that of the developed countries. Another critical thing is that there is discussion going on making even the loans available at concessionary rates, so that we can get a large chunk and use it to address most of these challenges. Apart from the large chunk, there is the idea that these loans should target a lot of the areas where Africa particularly is vulnerable, where it has resources, where it has capacity. For example, we have the African Development Bank,
Right.
yes, among others, actually stepping up its role. We have the Global Economic Fund,
Right.
Environmental Facility. All of them are being encouraged to take a position with regard to Africa. So what remains at the end of the day is to have a project scaling method that will make funds available for those projects that will actually reverse the most important climate impacts.
All right. So, you know, Guled, on that question of financing, many promises were made at COP26, including meeting the $100 billion financing gap by developed countries. Has that progressed to more than just promises, or are we seeing more newer promises now?
On the climate financing, actually, we go back to Paris, where the developing countries have agreed in principle to pay the developing countries around $100 billion every year, and that hasn't happened. So COP26, that was supposed to basically conclude the agreements that were done in the Paris Agreement, actually it was agreed that the 100 billion was not enough, and it has to be increased by 130. What I have seen is some creative accounting by some countries, including loans that have nothing to do with climate financing into the basket. So our hope was that this COP will be the COP of implementation, where solid agreements will be put in place, especially on adaptation and climate financing.
Right. Unfortunately, we're out of time here, John, but what would be your idea of success for Africa at COP27?
The success Africa has recorded today is that Africa is speaking with one voice. It has set up a number of committees, the Group of Nations, the Ministerial Conference, the head of government. And we are bringing these issues to the front burner. 2 of the priorities have been agreed upon. Loss and damage, which is being championed by San Diego, yes. Then the agriculture. But we have not made success in the finance area. We have not made success in the technology area. We need funds. Even the multilateral development banks and the bilateral development banks need to come out more aggressively to provide the finance needed for these infrastructural projects that will actually curtail climate impact. They are not there yet. The developed countries need to transfer more technology to Africa. And we need to, like I said, the adaptability aspect.
Right.
We cannot overemphasize, because there is a lot of crisis going on in Africa today. We must be able to curb them.
Right.
Once we curb them, we will come to a period of stability. Yes, you know. So that much I can say. We are on the path there. The issues are still being presented every year. They will still be debated until when the world body as a whole, the COP, now decides to approve it for implementation.
Gulaid, your thoughts there. What would be your idea of success for Africa at COP27?
The main success for Africa will be that the wording on the loss and damage, it is strongly worded, and there is a follow-up, and there is a mechanism of how funding can be set up. There are now two options on how the funding can be done. One suggested that by the end of 2024, a mechanism will be put in place, and there will be some funding organization within the UN. And the second one actually will hold the funding mechanism till to 2023, end of 2023. So for Africa, the success will be loss of damage that comes up in the final document with a more stronger wording than it has been, and more funding to adaptation. At the end of the day, why Africa is more weaker on adaptation is that our institution and our economies are weaker. Our economies are built on mostly agriculture that depends on climate. That's why a drought turns to disaster in some regions of Africa, while drought happens everywhere and it doesn't become disaster. So we have to build our capacities and move away from relying on agriculture that's dependent on climate.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for being a part of this discussion. But that's all we have time for this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests. Professor Lee White, Minister of Forests, Oceans, Environment and Climate Change of the Gabonese Republic. Gulaid Artan, Director of the IGAD Climate Prediction and Applications Center, and John Ekoko, Climate and Environmental Expert. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.